Welcome to the lecture Game Design and Game Development. Now we will discuss the topic of classic game genres. To make it easier to find the relevant information later, we see the list of content here. Before we get to the different game genres, we need to understand the following. The definitions of game genres are independent of the setting or the story. They are also independent of the medium used, such as a PC, a console, a cell phone, a board game, etc. We want to define game genres solely by the way the player interacts with the game. Take a short break and think about how many game genres you can already list. You've certainly come up with a lot, but even if not, let's take a look at the top 15 together. Okay, let's start with the first one. With action games, we are entering perhaps the biggest genre. Action games focus on physical challenges that require hand-eye coordination and motor skills to master. They focus on the player, who controls most of the action. Many of the earliest video games were called action games. Today, action games are divided into many subcategories. Adventure games also describe a large class of games and subgenres. The gameplay does not involve reflex challenges or action. As a rule, the player has to solve various puzzles by interacting with people or the environment. Branching narratives are often used, which allow for multiple endings. Because they impose little pressure on the player in the form of action-oriented challenges or time constraints, adventure games have the unique ability to appeal to people who don't normally play video games. Horror games belong to a genre of games that incorporate elements of horror fiction into their narrative and are generally independent of the type of game. This makes it one of the few major video game categories that are differentiated according to narrative elements and not gameplay. Horror games aim to evoke fear, suspense, and thrills in players through atmospheric narratives. This includes uncanny sound design and frightening images in threatening environments such as haunted houses, abandoned facilities, or post-apocalyptic landscapes. Game mechanics often involve resource management, sneaking, and puzzle solving, which heightens the sense of vulnerability and terror as players move through terrifying scenarios. Role-playing video games are based on traditional tabletop role-playing games. In most games, the player takes on the role of a character who gains strength and experience as the game progresses. By overcoming difficult challenges, the player receives experience points that represent the character's progress. These enable the player to acquire new skills. Many role-playing games contain an open world known as the overworld, which is usually populated with monsters and allows access to more important game locations such as towns, dungeons, and castles. Strategy games focus on gameplay that requires careful and skillful thinking and planning to achieve victory, and the action ranges from world domination to troop-based tactics. In most strategy video games, the player has a godlike view of the game world and indirectly controls the units under his command. Real-time strategy games are often a game in which multiple units are selected. Multiple game characters can be selected simultaneously to accomplish different tasks, as opposed to selecting only one character at a time with a sky view looking down from above. Okay, it's time to play a game. Close your eyes for a moment and repeat the first 5 game genres. You get 1 point for each correct answer. Pause the video for this task. Open your eyes. You have certainly collected all the points, but can you name a game for each of the genres? Pause the video for this task. Fighting games are a type of action game in which 2 or more characters fight each other on the screen. These games are usually characterized by special movements that are triggered by a rapid sequence of carefully timed button presses and joystick movements. The games traditionally show the fighters from a side view. Fighting games are usually about hand-to-hand combat, although many games also feature characters with melee weapons. The fighting characters are usually modeled on humans. Serious boxing games belong to the sports game genre rather than the action game genre, as they aim for a more realistic model of boxing techniques, whereas the moves in fighting games are either highly exaggerated or downright fantastical models of Asian martial arts techniques. This is why boxing games, mixed martial arts games, and wrestling games are often referred to as separate genres. Puzzle games are designed to challenge the brain by solving puzzles. They put the player's problem-solving skills to the test, including logic, pattern recognition, solving sequences, and completing words. Puzzle games focus on logical and conceptual challenges, although some of them also include a real-time component and require quick thinking. Rather than presenting a random collection of puzzles to solve, puzzle games typically offer a series of related puzzles that present a variation on a single theme. This theme may be about pattern recognition, logic, or understanding a process. These games usually have a set of rules or mechanisms where players manipulate game pieces on a grid, net, or other interaction space. Players must unravel clues to fulfill a specific victory condition that allows them to advance to the next level. Solving each puzzle usually leads to a more difficult challenge. Racing games are a video game genre in which the player takes part in a racing competition. They can be based on anything from real-life racing leagues to fantastical scenarios. They move along a spectrum between more realistic racing simulations and more fantastical arcade racing games. Racing games can also fall under the category of sports video games. Sports games simulate the rules and gameplay of real sports with varying degrees of accuracy. The opposing teams can be controlled by other players or by artificial intelligence. Licensed teams and players often come into play to increase the level of realism and thus immersion. Shooter video games are a subgenre of action video games that focus on defeating the character's enemies while providing the player with ranged weapons. Typically, these weapons are firearms or other ranged weapons that can be used in combination with other tools such as grenades for an indirect attack, armor for additional defense, or accessories such as scopes to alter the weapon's behavior. A common resource in many shooter games is ammunition, armor or health, or upgrades that improve the player character's weapons. Shooter games test the player's spatial awareness, reflexes, and speed in both isolated single-player and networked multiplayer environments. Shooter games comprise many subgenres whose commonality is that they focus on the actions of the avatar, who fights with a weapon against both code-controlled NPC enemies and other avatars controlled by other players. Okay, it's time for another short game. Close your eyes again for a moment and repeat the last 5 game genres. You get 1 point for each correct answer. Pause the video for the task. Open your eyes. You have certainly collected all the points again, but can you name a game for each of the genres? Pause the video briefly here too. Platformer games are primarily about jumping and climbing to find your way around the player's environment. There may be enemies or obstacles to avoid and fight, or they may be pure jumping puzzles. In general, the playable characters in a platformer can jump many times their own height, and the player has some control over their movements in the air as well as the height and distance of their jumps. The locations tend to be vertically exaggerated, with lots of uneven terrain for the player to jump on or fall from. There are often enemies, points, and special items that can be collected. Simulation video games are a diverse supercategory of games that are generally designed to accurately simulate aspects of a real or fictional reality. From construction and management simulations to life simulations, vehicle simulations, and much more. In survival games, the player starts with minimal resources in a hostile open world and must gather resources, craft tools, weapons, and shelter to survive as long as possible. Many of these games are set in procedurally generated environments and have an open ending with no fixed objectives. They can overlap with the survival horror genre, where the player must survive in a supernatural environment, such as a zombie apocalypse. Sandbox games involve a gameplay element that provides the player with a high degree of creativity in completing tasks to achieve an objective within the game, if such an objective exists. More often, sandbox games are created when these creative elements are integrated into other genres and allow for emergent gameplay. Sandbox games are often associated with open-world concepts that allow the player freedom of movement and progression in the game world. The term sandbox is derived from the nature of a sandbox, where children can create almost anything they want. Educational games, as the name suggests, attempt to teach the user something by using the game as a vehicle. Most of these types of games are aimed at young users from around the age of 3 to mid-teens. There are numerous subgenres. Okay, it's time for another short game. Close your eyes again for a moment and repeat the last 5 game genres. You get 1 point for each correct answer. Pause the video for the task. Open your eyes. You have certainly collected all the points again, but can you name a game for each of the genres? Pause the video briefly here too. Other subdivisions and classes of game genres can also be found in the literature. I am quite satisfied with the 15 basic classes presented here. They form the basis for further concepts in the lectures. The interesting thing about games is that they are based on creativity. Game development has a large overlap with art. It is therefore not surprising that combinations of genres are what make new game ideas so appealing. Let's take a look at a classic combination genre. Action-adventure games combine elements of both genres, as they usually feature long-term obstacles that must be overcome using a tool or item that has been previously collected, as well as many smaller obstacles that are almost constantly in the way and require elements of action games to overcome. Action-adventure games generally focus on exploration and usually involve collecting items, solving simple puzzles, and combat. Action-adventure has become a label that is sometimes attached to games that don't exactly fit into another well-known genre. Due to their widespread use on video game consoles and the lack of typical adventure games, action-adventure games are often referred to as adventure games by modern gamers. The action-adventure became often a compelling hybrid by combining elements from different genres, including exploration, transportation puzzles, adventure-style inventory puzzles, an action component, a money system, and simplified RPG-style level building without experience points. After listening carefully to this lecture, answering the following comprehension question should help you to summarize the most important statements again on your own.